Officer David Carter shifted in his seat, squinting into the afternoon sun as he steered his patrol car through the narrow streets of Ridgeview, a small, sleepy town nestled in rural America. The town had its fair share of quiet corners, but in David's mind, Ridgeview was his to protect, his domain. He had been on the force for nearly 20 years, and in that time, he had seen little more than bar fights, the occasional burglary, and a handful of domestic disputes, the kind of action his colleagues in bigger cities would scoff at. David was a proud man. He believed in law and order, strict, old-school justice. But there was something more insidious under the surface. As he drove past the neat rows of houses with well-manicured lawns, he thought about the small changes he had seen in the community over the years. Ridgeview had once been a homogeneous town, predominantly white, where everyone knew everyone else. But as the nearby city expanded, Ridgeview's complexion had begun to shift. New families moved in, families who didn't look like the Ridgeview David had grown up in. That's when his subtle, unchecked biases had begun to fester. It wasn't overt. David prided himself on being professional. But deep down, there was always a prickle of unease when he saw a face that didn't blend into the crowd. People like him, people who, in his mind, belonged. It was a slow afternoon. As he cruised past Maplewood Park, he noticed a few kids kicking a soccer ball around and a couple walking their dog. Nothing out of the ordinary. That was until he spotted a man sitting alone on a bench, a tall figure, reading a book. Samuel Brooks, dressed in a casual shirt and jeans, had chosen the park as a brief refuge from the stress of the day. As an FBI agent, Samuel's life was filled with tension, long hours, and the weight of important cases. But today was supposed to be a break. A moment of calm before he delved back into the chaos of his work. David's eyes narrowed as his gaze settled on Samuel. The sight stirred something within him, a quiet, lingering discomfort. Samuel didn't fit, not in this part of town, not on this quiet, sun-dappled bench in a park where David had watched generations of Ridgeview's families picnic, laugh, and play. He slowed the car and pulled over to the curb, watching Samuel for a moment longer. A stranger, he thought, doesn't look like he belongs. He couldn't place it, but something about the way Samuel sat there, too calm, too composed, made his skin prickle. As Samuel turned the page of his book, he felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. His instincts, honed over years in law enforcement, immediately kicked in. Without lifting his head, his eyes scanned his surroundings. It didn't take long for him to spot the patrol car parked a few yards away, the officer inside staring at him with an intensity that was all too familiar. Samuel sighed inwardly. This wasn't the first time he had found himself under scrutiny for simply existing in a space where people like him, black men in predominantly white spaces, weren't expected to be. His hand tightened slightly on the cover of the book, but he kept his movements deliberate and slow. He wasn't in the mood for trouble today, but he knew better than to give anyone a reason to escalate things. David sat in his patrol car for a moment longer, letting his mind rationalize what his gut was already telling him. He had seen the reports, vague descriptions of a suspect from the city involved in some kind of criminal activity. The description was flimsy, to say the least. A tall black male, early to mid-30s, athletic build. The kind of description that could fit thousands of men. Still, it was enough for David. He opened the door and stepped out of the car, his boots crunching on the gravel as he made his way towards Samuel. "Let's see what this guy's up to," he muttered to himself, his posture rigid with authority. His hand hovered near the baton at his side, a reflex more than anything else. Samuel heard the footsteps approaching and closed his book, his finger marking the page. He looked up just as David came to a stop a few feet from the bench, casting a long shadow over him. Samuel met the officer's gaze, his expression calm but firm. "Afternoon, officer," Samuel said, his voice polite but guarded. He knew where this was heading. He had seen it play out too many times before. David didn't respond right away. He sized Samuel up, his eyes flicking over the man's clothes, his posture, the book in his hands. Something about the way Samuel looked at him, steady, unafraid, unnerved him. There was no fear in his eyes, no hint of the nervousness David had come to expect in situations like this. "Mind if I ask what you're doing out here today?" David finally said, his tone casual, but the edge was unmistakable. Samuel smiled slightly, though the gesture didn't reach his eyes. Just enjoying the park. It's a nice day. David nodded slowly, though he wasn't really listening. He was fishing for something to justify the suspicion gnawing at him. You from around here? Samuel's smile faded. He had learned long ago that questions like these were rarely about curiosity. They were about control. I've been around, he said simply. The non-answer didn't sit well with David. His grip on the baton tightened slightly. Mind if I see some ID? Samuel knew this was the moment where things could go sideways. He had been through this enough times to recognize the signs, the subtle shift in posture, the hardening of the officer's gaze. He wasn't obligated to show ID just for sitting in a public park. But refusing could escalate the situation quickly, and he wasn't going to give David that satisfaction. Am I under arrest? Samuel asked, his voice measured, but there was a firmness in his tone. He met David's gaze without flinching. David bristled at the question. That calmness again, that refusal to be intimidated, it made his skin crawl. You will be if you don't cooperate, David shot back, his hand moving to rest on his holster. Samuel took a slow breath, his mind already calculating the next steps. He wasn't going to back down, but he also wasn't going to let this officer bait him into a reaction. I'm just sitting in a park, he said evenly. Is there a law against that? David's patience was wearing thin. You fit the description of someone we're looking for, he said, though even he knew how weak the excuse sounded. He stepped closer, looming over Samuel. Samuel didn't move. He held David's gaze, refusing to give him the reaction he was looking for. And what description is that? Samuel asked quietly. David's jaw tightened. He didn't have a good answer, and he knew it. But admitting that would mean losing face, losing control, and he wasn't about to let that happen. Don't get smart with me, he snapped. Show me some ID, now. For a moment, the two men locked eyes, the tension between them thick enough to cut. Samuel knew he could push back, could assert his rights, but he also knew that doing so could make the situation even more dangerous. He decided to comply, for now. Without a word, he reached into his pocket slowly, deliberately, and pulled out his wallet. David watched every movement closely, his body coiled like a spring. When Samuel handed over his ID, David snatched it from him and glanced at it. The name Samuel Brooks didn't mean anything to him, but that didn't matter. David had already made up his mind about who Samuel was. Stand up, David ordered, stepping back to give Samuel room. Samuel sighed inwardly, but did as he was told, rising slowly from the bench. He kept his hands visible, not wanting to give David any reason to claim he felt threatened. Turn around, David said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. Samuel felt a surge of frustration but pushed it down. He turned around, letting David cuff him without resistance. He could hear people nearby, could feel their eyes on him, but he stayed calm, knowing that the worst thing he could do now was let his anger show. As David tightened the cuffs around Samuel's wrists, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that he was making a mistake. But his pride wouldn't let him stop now. He grabbed Samuel's arm and started leading him towards the patrol car parked nearby. The ride to the precinct was silent, save for the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle from the police radio. Samuel sat in the back seat, the cold metal of the handcuffs biting into his wrists, but he remained composed. His mind wasn't on the discomfort or the absurdity of the situation. Instead, it was focused on what would come next. He had dealt with officers like David Carter before, men whose authority was rooted more in their own insecurities than in the law they were sworn to uphold. The arrogance, the need to control, and the willingness to assume the worst about someone based on their skin color were all familiar to him. But this time, it felt different. This time, he wasn't just a black man sitting in a park. He was an FBI agent, and that fact would soon come crashing down on Carter and the rest of the Ridgeview Police Department. The patrol car pulled up to the station, and David parked near the entrance, getting out first before opening the back door. Samuel stepped out, his movements slow and deliberate, knowing that even a slight hesitation could be interpreted as resistance. Inside the precinct, the usual hum of activity filled the air. Officers filed reports, phones rang, and conversations buzzed, but the atmosphere changed slightly as David walked Samuel through the main hall. Eyes turned toward them, some curious, some surprised, and a few even skeptical. David led Samuel to a small room, the typical cold and sterile booking area, with a desk in the center. Behind it sat Officer Daniel Howard, a younger officer with a fresh face, his uniform crisp and clean compared to the more worn and rumpled appearance of David. Howard looked up as they approached, his brow furrowing slightly at the sight of Samuel in cuffs. "What's this about?" Howard asked, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty as his eyes flicked between David and Samuel. David handed over Samuel's ID, his tone clipped. "Caught him acting suspicious in the park," he said, as though that were enough explanation. Howard glanced at the ID, his eyes lingering on the name for a moment longer than usual. There was a flicker of recognition in his gaze, but he quickly masked it, nodding as he began typing into the computer. Samuel noticed the brief hesitation and filed it away in his mind. Someone in this precinct recognized his name, or at least had the sense that something wasn't quite right about the situation. He remained silent, though, his expression unreadable as he watched David out of the corner of his eye. "I'll need to run this by Captain Foster," Howard said after a moment, his tone careful. "He'll want to be informed about this." David stiffened slightly at the mention of the captain. Captain Robert Foster was known for being a no-nonsense leader, tough but fair, and a stickler for protocol. David hadn't planned on involving him so soon, but he knew he didn't have much choice. If there was any hesitation from Howard, the captain would need to be brought in. "Fine," David muttered, his grip on Samuel's arm tightening slightly as he turned to lead him toward the holding area. As they walked through the precinct, Samuel kept his expression neutral, though he could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He wasn't worried about his own fate. He knew his superiors at the FBI would be notified soon enough, but the larger implications of what had just happened hung in the air. This was bigger than one arrest. It was about the system that allowed officers like David to act on their biases without consequence. And Samuel knew that it was time for that system to be exposed. Back in the holding cell, Samuel sat on the bench, his hands resting on his knees as he waited for what he knew was coming. It didn't take long. The door creaked open, and Officer Daniel Howard stepped inside, a slight look of discomfort on his face. He held out a phone, his voice quieter now as though aware of the gravity of the situation. "You're allowed one phone call," he said, avoiding Samuel's gaze. Samuel took the phone, his fingers dialing a number that was second nature to him. It rang twice before a voice on the other end answered. It was Special Agent Michelle Carter, his direct superior at the FBI. "Agent Brooks," she said, her voice calm but authoritative. "What's going on?" Samuel exhaled softly, the weight of the day settling in. "I've been arrested by a local officer here in Ridgeview. His name's David Carter." There was a pause on the other end. "Arrested?" Michelle's voice hardened slightly. "What for?" "Nothing," Samuel replied evenly. "He thought I looked suspicious sitting in the park. I showed him my ID, told him I was FBI, but he didn't believe me." A longer pause followed. "I see," Michelle finally said, her tone cold with the implication of what would follow. "We'll handle this. You'll be out of there soon. Stay put." Samuel handed the phone back to Officer Howard, who took it with a faint nod before leaving the cell. He knew it wouldn't be long now before the real consequences of David's actions started to unfold. As Samuel waited in the holding cell, the atmosphere in the precinct began to shift. Officers moved about their business, but there was a growing tension in the air, a sense that something was about to happen. It wasn't long before the door to the station opened with a loud creak, and in walked three men dressed in dark suits, their presence immediately commanding attention. The men, all FBI agents, approached the front desk with purpose. The officer on duty, Sergeant Alan Moore, a seasoned veteran of the force, looked up, his expression shifting from casual indifference to alarm as they flashed their badges. "We're here for Samuel Brooks," the lead agent said, his tone clipped and authoritative. Sergeant Moore blinked, taken aback. "Brooks?" he repeated, confusion crossing his face. I'll have to get the captain. Just a moment." As Moore hurried off to find Captain Foster, the three agents stood silently, their expressions unreadable. The tension in the precinct continued to grow as whispers spread among the officers. Word traveled fast in small departments like this one, and it wasn't long before everyone knew that something big was happening. In his office, Captain Foster was reviewing paperwork when Sergeant Moore burst in, his face flushed with urgency. "Captain, we've got FBI agents out front asking for the guy we brought in, Samuel Brooks. They said he's one of theirs." Captain Foster's eyes widened slightly, but he quickly masked his surprise. He had heard the name before. Samuel Brooks was a well-known agent in certain circles, respected for his work in high-profile cases. The fact that he had been arrested by one of his officers without proper cause was a big problem. "Bring them in," Foster said, rising from his desk, "and get Carter in here. Now." David Carter stood in the hallway outside Captain Foster's office, his heart pounding in his chest. He had seen the FBI agents enter the precinct, had heard the whispers among his fellow officers, and now, as he waited to be called in, the reality of what he had done began to settle over him like a suffocating weight. He had arrested an FBI agent, a federal agent. And for what? Because he had looked suspicious? Because he had assumed the worst about a man who had been sitting peacefully in a park? The door to Foster's office opened, and Sergeant Moore beckoned him inside. David swallowed hard and stepped through the doorway, his stomach churning with a mix of fear and denial. Inside the office, Captain Foster sat behind his desk, his expression hard and unreadable. Across from him stood the 3 FBI agents, their eyes fixed on David as though they were dissecting him with their gaze. The tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. "Officer Carter," Foster began, his voice calm but cold, "I assume you know why you're here?" David nodded, though his throat felt dry. "Yes, sir." One of the FBI agents, the one who had spoken earlier, stepped forward. His badge read Agent Gregory Allen, and his eyes were cold and unforgiving as they bore into David. "You arrested one of our agents today," he said, his tone sharp. "Samuel Brooks. Do you know what that means?" David opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He had no explanation that could justify what he had done. "It means," Agent Allen continued, "that you made a grave mistake. Agent Brooks was on official business, and you arrested him without cause. You ignored his credentials, his identification, and you escalated a situation that didn't need to be escalated." David felt the blood drain from his face. He could feel the weight of the consequences pressing down on him, but his pride wouldn't let him back down completely. "I was just doing my job," he said, though his voice sounded weak even to his own ears. "He fit the description of a suspect we were looking for." Agent Allen's eyes narrowed. "A suspect?" he repeated, his tone dripping with disbelief. "The only thing Agent Brooks fit was your preconceived bias. And that, Officer Carter, is going to cost you." The fallout was swift. Within hours, word of Samuel Brooks's wrongful arrest had spread throughout the town and beyond. News outlets picked up the story, and soon it was making headlines across the state. "Local officer arrests FBI agent without cause," the headlines read, and the public outrage was immediate. David Carter was placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation, but the damage had already been done. His reputation, once solid within the department, had been shattered. Colleagues who had once respected him now kept their distance, wary of being associated with the fallout. At home, things were no better. David's wife, Linda, had always supported him throughout his career, but now even she was struggling to come to terms with what had happened. Their house, once a sanctuary, was filled with tension and silence. Linda tried to be understanding, but the media coverage and the whispers from neighbors were impossible to ignore. "I just don't understand, David," Linda said one evening as they sat at the dinner table, the TV in the background muted, but still showing images of the story that had rocked their town. "Why didn't you just listen to him? If he showed you his badge, why didn't you check it?" David stared down at his plate, his appetite long gone. He didn't have an answer that could satisfy her or himself. "I don't know," he mumbled. "I thought he was faking it. It didn't seem right." Linda sighed, her frustration barely contained. "But he wasn't faking it. And now look what's happened. They're talking about firing you, David. You could lose everything." "I know," David snapped, his voice louder than he intended. He immediately regretted it, but the stress of the situation was getting to him. "I know, Linda. You think I haven't thought about that? I was just trying to do my job." Linda's eyes softened, but the hurt was still there. "Your job is to protect and serve, David, not to assume the worst about people." David didn't respond. He couldn't, because deep down, he knew she was right. While David's world was unraveling, Samuel Brooks returned to his life, though not without its own complications. The incident had left a mark on him, a reminder that no matter how high he rose in his career, no matter how much he accomplished, There were still people who would see him as nothing more than a black man in the wrong place at the wrong time. In the days following his release, Samuel received calls from colleagues, friends, and even strangers, all expressing their outrage over what had happened. The FBI had been supportive, but Samuel knew that this was far from an isolated incident. It wasn't the first time he had been profiled, and it likely wouldn't be the last. He sat in his apartment one evening, the soft glow of his laptop illuminating the room as he typed up a report on the case he had been working on before the arrest. His mind, however, kept drifting back to David Carter and the look in the officer's eyes when he had arrested him. It was a look Samuel had seen before: fear, suspicion, and an unwavering belief in his own authority. But there had also been something else. Regret, maybe, or doubt. Samuel wasn't one to dwell on grudges, but this time, he felt something deeper. He didn't want revenge, but he did want accountability. He wanted people like David to understand the consequences of their actions, to see the harm they caused when they acted on prejudice rather than facts. He picked up his phone and dialed a number, waiting as it rang. After a moment, a voice answered. "Michelle Carter." "It's Samuel," he said. "I've been thinking about what happened." Michelle, his superior at the FBI, was quiet for a moment. "We've got the ball rolling on the investigation. Carter's already on leave, and the internal review is underway. This won't go unanswered." "I know," Samuel replied, "but that's not enough. We need to make sure this kind of thing doesn't happen again. Not just to me, but to anyone." Michelle sighed softly. "You're right, but change takes time, and you know how the system works. We'll push for as much accountability as we can, but don't expect it to be quick." Samuel leaned back in his chair, staring out the window at the city lights beyond. "It has to start somewhere," he said quietly. Back at the Ridgeview Police Department, the internal investigation into David Carter's actions was in full swing. Captain Robert Foster had called in the department's Internal Affairs Division, and they were thorough. Every detail of David's arrest of Samuel was scrutinized: his behavior, his decision-making process, and the steps he took or didn't take to verify Samuel's identity. David had been called in for multiple interviews, each one more uncomfortable than the last. He sat in a small, dimly lit room with Detective Andrea Mills, a sharp-eyed investigator from Internal Affairs, sitting across from him. A tape recorder sat on the table between them, its red light blinking steadily. "Officer Carter," Mills began, her voice calm but firm, "we've reviewed the footage from your body camera as well as the statements from witnesses in the park. It's clear that Agent Brooks complied with your instructions and presented valid identification. Why did you continue to escalate the situation?" David swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I didn't think it was real. I thought he was trying to deceive me." Mills raised an eyebrow. "And why would you think that?" David shifted in his seat, his discomfort growing. He knew where this was going, but he wasn't ready to admit it. Not yet. "He didn't look like he belonged there," he said finally, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Mills didn't react outwardly, but her eyes sharpened. "Didn't look like he belonged," she repeated. "Can you explain what you mean by that?" David hesitated. He knew what she was asking, and he knew what it sounded like. He didn't seem like someone who would be sitting in the park, alone." Reading Mills leaned forward slightly, her gaze never leaving his. "Do you think you would have reacted the same way if Agent Brooks had been a white man sitting in the park?" David's heart pounded in his chest. He knew the answer, but he couldn't bring himself to say it out loud. Instead, he sat in silence, the weight of his unspoken admission hanging in the air. Mills nodded slowly, as though his silence had given her all the confirmation she needed. "Officer Carter, this department has strict policies regarding racial profiling. What you've just described, whether you intended it or not, falls under that category. The consequences of your actions go beyond this one incident. They affect the trust between law enforcement and the community we're supposed to serve." David stared at the table, his hands clenched into fists. He had always prided himself on being a good cop, someone who upheld the law and kept his town safe. But now that image was crumbling before his eyes, and he had no one to blame but himself. Weeks passed as the investigation continued, and the tension in Ridgeview only grew. The media attention surrounding the case had not died down, and David found himself increasingly isolated. Colleagues who had once been his friends now avoided him, not wanting to be caught in the crossfire. His family life, too, had become strained. Linda had stopped asking him about the case, but the silence between them spoke volumes. Finally, the day came when David was called into Captain Foster's office for the final decision. He stood outside the door, his palms sweating as he waited for what felt like an eternity. When the door finally opened, Foster stood behind his desk, his expression grave. "Come in, Carter," he said, his voice giving nothing away. David stepped inside, his heart pounding in his chest as he took a seat across from the captain. Foster sat down, folding his hands on the desk in front of him. "The investigation is complete," Foster began, his tone formal. "Internal Affairs has found that your actions during the arrest of Agent Samuel Brooks were in violation of department policies, specifically those regarding racial profiling and use of force." David's stomach dropped, but he forced himself to remain still, waiting for the inevitable. "As a result," Foster continued, "you are being placed on unpaid suspension, effective immediately. Further disciplinary action, including possible termination, will be determined pending the outcome of a formal review." David felt the world tilt beneath him. Suspension. He had expected it, but hearing the words spoken out loud was like a punch to the gut. "You're lucky this isn't worse," Foster added, his voice softer but no less stern. "Agent Brooks could have pressed charges. The fact that he hasn't doesn't absolve you of what you did, but it could have been a lot worse." David nodded numbly, his mind racing. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Foster sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Now you take some time to reflect. Think about what got you to this point. This department has no place for officers who let their biases dictate their actions. If you want to salvage your career, you need to start by acknowledging your mistakes." David stood slowly, the weight of Foster's words pressing down on him like a physical burden. He gave a small nod before turning to leave the office, his mind a tangled mess of regret, fear, and uncertainty. Linda's eyes widened in surprise, but she didn't back down. "That's not what I said, but I think maybe there's more to this than just a misunderstanding. David, you've always prided yourself on knowing this town, on protecting it. But have you ever thought that maybe your instincts aren't always right?" David stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. He didn't want to admit it, didn't want to acknowledge the doubt that had been creeping into his mind since the day of the arrest. But now, with Linda looking at him like that, he couldn't ignore it any longer. "I was just doing my job," David muttered, his voice hollow. "I thought he was a threat." Linda reached across the table and took his hand, her touch gentle but firm. "Maybe it's time to start asking yourself why you thought that." Meanwhile, Samuel Brooks hadn't forgotten about Ridgeview or Officer David Carter. Though the FBI had handled the internal investigation, and Samuel had been released without further incident, the town and its police department remained under scrutiny. For Samuel, the issue wasn't just about his own experience. It was about changing the way law enforcement operated in communities like Ridgeview. 1 month after the arrest, Samuel returned to Ridgeview, not as an agent on assignment, but as a speaker at a community forum organized to address racial profiling and police misconduct. It wasn't a typical move for an FBI agent, but Samuel had made it clear to his superiors that this was something he wanted to do. The forum was held at the Ridgeview Community Center, a modest building that rarely saw such events. The auditorium was packed with a mix of residents, some eager to listen, others defensive, and a few unsure of what to expect. Samuel stood at the front of the room, his tall frame commanding attention as he prepared to speak. His calm demeanor belied the tension in the room. He knew that many people in Ridgeview didn't want to hear what he had to say, but he also knew that this conversation was long overdue. "Good evening," Samuel began, his voice steady but firm. "My name is Samuel Brooks, and I'm here tonight not just as an FBI agent, but as a citizen, someone who has experienced firsthand the kind of profiling and prejudice that many people in this country still face. What happened here in Ridgeview wasn't just about me. It's about a larger issue that we need to address, together." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "I know that many of you believe Officer Carter was just doing his job, but I'm here to tell you that what happened to me shouldn't happen to anyone, ever. No one should be treated as suspicious just because of the color of their skin, and no one should be arrested without cause." As Samuel spoke, the room remained quiet, but the tension was palpable. Some residents nodded in agreement, while others crossed their arms, their expressions hardening. In the end, Samuel continued, this isn't just about pointing fingers or assigning blame. It's about recognizing that we have a problem and working together to fix it. Ridgeview can be better. It can be a place where everyone is treated with fairness and respect, where the police protect and serve all citizens, regardless of who they are or what they look like. When Samuel finished speaking, there was a long moment of silence. Then slowly a few people began to clap. The applause grew louder, but it wasn't unanimous. Some still refused to engage, their faces set in stubborn resistance. But Samuel knew that change didn't happen overnight. This was just the beginning. David Carter didn't attend the community forum, but he heard about it. The next day, he sat alone in his living room, the sound of the television murmuring in the background. He couldn't stop thinking about what Linda had said, and now hearing about Samuel's speech, the doubt that had been gnawing at him grew stronger. He hadn't wanted to admit it to himself, but the truth was becoming harder to ignore. He had acted on instinct that day in the park, but whose instincts were they? His own, shaped by years of growing up in a town where people like Samuel Brooks were seen as outsiders? Or the instincts of a cop who had learned to be suspicious of anyone who didn't fit a certain mold? David stared at his reflection in the darkened window, his mind replaying the events of the arrest. The way Samuel had looked at him, calm but firm, the way he had complied without resistance, even though he had every reason to fight back. Why hadn't David listened? Why had he assumed the worst? The answer was staring him in the face, but it was an answer he wasn't sure he was ready to confront. The next day, David made a decision. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he had never thought he would use. Samuel Brooks' contact number, provided by the FBI after the investigation concluded. His hands shook slightly as the phone rang on the other end, but he didn't hang up. After a few rings, Samuel answered. "This is Samuel Brooks." David swallowed hard, his throat tight. "It's David Carter," he said, his voice low. "Officer Carter." There was a brief pause on the other end before Samuel responded. "What can I do for you, Officer Carter?" David hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. I need to talk to you, not as a cop, just as one man to another. I've been thinking a lot about what happened, and I need to apologize for what I did, for how I treated you." Samuel was silent for a moment, and David could almost feel the weight of his words hanging in the air. "I'm listening," Samuel finally said, his voice calm but guarded. David took a deep breath, the words tumbling out of him faster than he had intended. "I messed up. I made assumptions about you that I shouldn't have. I thought I was doing my job, but I realize now that I was wrong. I should have listened. I should have treated you with the respect you deserved. And I'm sorry." The silence that followed was agonizing, but David didn't try to fill it. He had said what he needed to say, and now all he could do was wait. When Samuel spoke again, his voice was measured, but there was no anger in it. "Apologies are a start, Officer Carter, but they're not enough. What happened between us is part of a much bigger problem, one that won't be fixed with just words. If you really want to make things right, you need to be willing to change, to look at the way you see the world and ask yourself some hard questions." David nodded, even though Samuel couldn't see him. "I'm ready to do that. I don't know what comes next, but I'm ready to start." Samuel's tone softened slightly. "That's all anyone can ask. It's a long road, Carter, but if you're willing to walk it, you'll find people who will walk it with you." David felt a strange sense of relief wash over him, as though a weight he had been carrying for too long had finally begun to lift. "Thank you," David said quietly. "I won't forget this." "Neither will I," Samuel replied. David hung up the phone, his mind racing with everything that had just happened. The conversation with Samuel hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. For the first time since the arrest, David felt like he was taking a step in the right direction. He didn't know what the future held for him, whether he would be able to return to the police force or if he even wanted to. But what he did know was that he had a lot to learn, a lot to reflect on, and a lot to change. As David sat in the quiet of his home, he realized that the road ahead would be long and difficult. But for the first time in his life, he was ready to walk it. David Carter sat at the edge of his bed, the weight of the last few weeks pressing down on him. His conversation with Samuel Brooks replayed in his mind, each word echoing with the force of a reality he had long resisted. The journey ahead was daunting, but for the first time in his life, David knew that he needed to face the hard truths about himself and the role he had played in perpetuating systemic bias. As he stared at the morning light streaming through the blinds, David knew one thing for sure. There was no going back to the way things were. He couldn't ignore what had happened. He couldn't pretend that his actions had been justified or that they hadn't caused real harm. And most importantly, he couldn't deny that the world he had grown up in, the world he had thought he understood, was changing, had to change. After his suspension, David realized he was at a crossroads. Returning to the Ridgeview Police Department felt like an impossibility, but leaving law enforcement altogether didn't feel right either. He had dedicated his life to serving his community, but now he questioned what kind of service he had really been providing. Linda had been supportive in the days following his call to Samuel. She didn't ask for details, but David could sense a shift in her attitude. More patience, more understanding. He appreciated that she was giving him space, but he knew they needed to talk about the future soon. As he contemplated his next steps, his phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a message from Captain Foster. David's heart skipped a beat as he read the brief text. "Carter, come to the station. We need to talk. Foster." David stared at the screen for a long moment before standing up. The time had come to face whatever decision the department had made about his future. When David entered the Ridgeview Police Department, he could feel the weight of every eye on him. Some officers looked away, uncomfortable, while others watched him with barely concealed judgment. It was as though the very atmosphere of the station had changed since his suspension, and David knew that the cracks in the department were becoming more visible. He walked down the hallway to Captain Foster's office, his steps heavy, each one feeling like it could be his last as an officer. The door was already open, and when David knocked lightly on the frame, Foster looked up from his desk. "Come in," Foster said, his tone as unreadable as ever. David stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The room felt smaller than usual, the walls closing in with the weight of the moment. Foster motioned for him to sit, and David obeyed, sinking into the chair across from his captain. Foster leaned back in his chair, studying David for a long moment before speaking. "The investigation is officially closed," he said, his voice low. "Internal Affairs found that your actions during the arrest of Samuel Brooks violated department policies, specifically the racial profiling protocols we've had in place for years." David nodded, already knowing where this was going. He had prepared himself for the worst. Foster sighed, rubbing his temples before continuing. "Carter, you've been a good cop for a long time. But what happened, what you did, can't be overlooked. The department has decided to offer you the option to resign, effective immediately, or face termination with the possibility of legal action from the FBI. David felt a cold chill run down his spine. It wasn't unexpected, but hearing it out loud still hit him like a punch to the gut. "I see," he said quietly. "And what happens if I resign?" Foster leaned forward, his expression serious but not unkind. "If you resign, the department will consider it a personal decision, and you won't face immediate legal consequences. The FBI won't pursue charges as long as they feel you've accepted responsibility for what happened. But if you refuse, they're ready to move forward with a federal case." David swallowed hard. He had known this day was coming, but now that it was here, it felt surreal. All the years he had spent building his career, his reputation, were crumbling before his eyes. But as much as it hurt, David knew what he had to do. He couldn't fight this. He didn't want to. He needed to move forward, and holding on to the past wasn't going to help anyone. Not himself, not Samuel, and certainly not the community. "I'll resign," David said after a long pause, his voice steady but filled with resignation. "I don't want to drag this out any longer." Foster nodded, relief flickering across his face. "I think that's the right decision," he said quietly. "This isn't the end for you, Carter. You've got a long road ahead, but it doesn't have to be the end of your life." David stood, feeling the weight of his decision settle over him like a heavy blanket. "Thank you, Captain, for everything." Foster rose as well, extending his hand. "Good luck, David." The handshake was brief, but in it, David felt the finality of his career as a police officer. He had chosen the path of resignation, But the real challenge lay ahead, finding redemption and making amends for the mistakes he had made. While David faced the reality of his resignation, Samuel Brooks continued his work at the FBI. But the events in Ridgeview weighed heavily on his mind. Samuel had always believed in justice, fairness, and the importance of law enforcement, but his experience with David had left him deeply unsettled. It wasn't just about the arrest. It was about the system that allowed officers like David to act on bias without immediate accountability. Samuel had spent years working on high-profile cases, but the Ridgeview incident made him realize that real change needed to happen at the grassroots level. It wasn't enough to solve individual cases of corruption or crime. He needed to address the systemic issues that led to these problems in the first place. With the support of his FBI colleagues, Samuel began working on a new initiative within the Bureau, a task force aimed at tackling racial bias in law enforcement. The goal was to provide better training for officers, improve accountability measures, and create stronger connections between police departments and the communities they served. The work wasn't easy. There was resistance both within the FBI and from local departments, many of whom were reluctant to acknowledge that racial bias was a problem at all. But Samuel remained determined. He had seen firsthand the damage that unchecked bias could do, and he was committed to ensuring that no one else would have to go through what he had. As the task force gained traction, Samuel found himself traveling to different cities, meeting with police chiefs, community leaders, and activists who were all working toward the same goal: creating a fairer, more just system of law enforcement. In many ways, the work was more fulfilling than anything he had done before. But even as he worked to bring about change, Samuel knew that the road ahead was long. The Ridgeview incident was just one example of a much larger issue. And while he could make a difference, he also knew that true progress would take years, if not decades. Still, Samuel remained hopeful. He had seen the worst of humanity during his time as an FBI agent, but he had also seen the best, and he believed that, with enough effort, real change was possible. Months after David's resignation, life in Ridgeview had returned to a semblance of normalcy, though the scars of the incident still lingered. The town was quieter, more introspective, and while some residents had moved on, others continued to wrestle with the deeper issues the arrest had brought to light. One afternoon, as Samuel was passing through Ridgeview on his way to another speaking engagement, he decided to stop by the park where everything had begun. He hadn't intended to linger, but something about the quietness of the place drew him in. As he walked through the park, he noticed a familiar figure sitting on one of the benches, the same bench where he had been sitting months earlier. It was David Carter. David looked up as Samuel approached, his expression a mix of surprise and uncertainty. For a moment, neither man spoke. The weight of their shared history hung between them like an invisible barrier. Finally, Samuel broke the silence. "Mind if I sit?" David shook his head, gesturing to the empty spot next to him. "Go ahead." The two men sat in silence for a while, the sound of children playing in the distance filling the air. Samuel glanced at David, noting the weariness in his face, the lines that hadn't been there the last time they met. "I didn't expect to see you here," Samuel said quietly. David shrugged. "I've been coming here a lot lately. Helps me think." Samuel nodded, understanding. "How have you been?" David let out a slow breath. "I've been better. Resigned from the force a while ago. Haven't figured out what comes next." "I heard," Samuel said. "I'm sorry things turned out the way they did." David shook his head. "Don't be. I made my bed. Now I've got to lie in it." The silence returned, but this time it felt less strained. After a few minutes, David spoke again. "You were right, about everything. I didn't want to admit it at the time, but I've had a lot of time to think. I messed up. Big time." Samuel listened, letting David get the words out without interrupting. "I've been trying to figure out how to fix things," David continued, "but I don't even know where to start." "You start by owning your mistakes," Samuel said simply. "You've already taken that step. Now it's about what you do next." David nodded, though he still seemed unsure. "And what if I don't know what that is?" Samuel smiled faintly. "You'll figure it out. The important thing is that you're willing to try." The two men sat in companionable silence for a while longer, the weight of their shared past slowly lifting. Neither of them knew what the future held, but for the first time, both felt a sense of closure. As the sun began to set over Ridgeview, David and Samuel stood from the bench, their conversation having come to a natural close. They exchanged a brief handshake. No longer as adversaries, but as two men who had walked through fire and emerged on the other side, changed but not broken. For David, the road ahead would be long and difficult. He had lost his career, his sense of purpose, and his standing in the community. But he had also gained something, an understanding of his own flaws, and a commitment to making amends for the harm he had caused. As for Samuel, his work continued. The task force he had helped create was gaining momentum, and more police departments across the country were starting to adopt new policies aimed at reducing racial bias. It was slow progress, but it was progress nonetheless. In the end, both men knew that their paths would cross again, perhaps not in Ridgeview, but in the larger fight for justice and equality. As they parted ways that evening, the park quiet around them, there was a sense of hope, a belief that no matter how difficult the journey, change was possible. And for David Carter, that change had already begun. David Carter stared at the ceiling of his small one-bedroom apartment, the hum of the city outside creating a rhythm that he had grown used to over the past several months. Life had become simple, stripped of the uniforms, badges, and sense of authority that had once defined him. He no longer woke up to the sound of his police radio or the bustle of Ridgeview Station. Instead, his mornings were quieter, filled with more reflection than action. After his resignation, David had spent weeks lost in uncertainty, unsure of what to do next. He had thought about moving away from Ridgeview, starting fresh somewhere else, but in the end he couldn't bring himself to leave the town that had been his home for so many years. Despite everything that had happened, Ridgeview was still a part of him, and he wasn't ready to abandon it just yet. He knew he needed to do more than just drift. He needed to find a way to contribute, to use the lessons he had learned to make a difference. It was Samuel's words that kept playing in his mind. "It's about what you do next." Those words haunted him, pushing him to do something, anything, that would help him atone for the mistakes he had made. It was during one of those sleepless nights, staring at the ceiling, that David made a decision. He wasn't going to run away from his past. Instead, he would face it head-on and find a way to help others avoid the same pitfalls that had led to his downfall. The next morning, David reached out to Ridgeview's Community Outreach Program, a small grassroots organization focused on helping at-risk youth in the area. He had always admired the work they did, though he had never taken an active role while he was a cop. Now he realized was the time to change that. David's first day with the outreach program felt like walking into a completely new world. The organization's headquarters was a modest building on the outskirts of town, far from the more polished, pristine parts of Ridgeview that David had once patrolled. The walls were covered in bright murals, and the air was filled with the sound of kids laughing, playing, and talking. David was greeted by Samantha Ellis, the program's director. She was a tall, no-nonsense woman in her early 40s, with a commanding presence and a heart that seemed to overflow with compassion for the kids she worked with. She eyed David with curiosity as he approached, clearly aware of his past, but she extended her hand warmly. "You must be David Carter," she said, shaking his hand firmly. "Heard you wanted to get involved." David nodded, feeling slightly out of place but determined to push through his discomfort. "Yeah," he replied. "I figured it's time I did something useful." Samantha studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Well, we've got plenty of work to go around. These kids need mentors, and most of them don't trust authority figures. You're going to have to earn their respect." David didn't miss the subtle dig at his former profession, but he didn't flinch. He knew he had to prove himself, not just to Samantha, but to the kids and to himself. "I understand," he said simply. Samantha led him through the building, explaining the program's goals and the challenges they faced. The kids who came through their doors were from all walks of life, but many were from disadvantaged backgrounds. Some had already had run-ins with the law, while others were struggling to find their way in a world that didn't always give them a fair chance. "They need guidance," Samantha said as they walked past a group of teenagers playing basketball outside. "They need someone to show them that they can break the cycle, that they don't have to end up in the system." David nodded, taking it all in. He had spent so many years on the other side, enforcing the law, often with little regard for the people caught in its grasp. Now he was beginning to see things from a different perspective. His first task was to mentor a small group of boys, all between the ages of 14 and 16. They were quiet at first, their distrust of David clear in the way they avoided eye contact and kept their conversations short. But David didn't push. He knew that earning their trust would take time, and he was prepared to put in the work. As the weeks went by, David started to find his place within the outreach program. He showed up every day, getting to know the kids, listening to their stories, and slowly building the trust that had been so elusive at first. He realized that, for many of these kids, authority figures like him had always been the enemy, someone to fear or avoid. But David was different now. He wasn't a cop anymore. He was just a man who had made mistakes and was trying to make amends. One afternoon, while David was helping some of the boys with a woodworking project, one of them, Marcus Thompson, a tall, lanky 15-year-old with a chip on his shoulder, finally spoke up. "You were a cop, right?" Marcus asked, his voice casual but laced with suspicion. David paused, setting down the hammer he had been using. "Yeah," he said, not shying away from the truth. "I was." Marcus narrowed his eyes, his hands fidgeting with the wood in front of him. "So why are you here? You're not gonna bust us, are you?" David chuckled softly, shaking his head. "No, I'm not here to bust anyone. I'm here to help. I messed up when I was a cop. I didn't always do the right thing, but I'm trying to fix that now." Marcus looked at him for a long moment, as though weighing whether to believe him. Finally, he nodded slightly. "I guess that's cool." It wasn't much, but it was a start. Over time, David began to see the changes in the kids he mentored. They started to open up to him, sharing their dreams, their frustrations, and their fears. David listened, offering advice when he could, but mostly just being there. Being someone they could rely on, someone who wasn't going to judge them. For David, the work was more fulfilling than anything he had ever done as a police officer. It wasn't about enforcing the law or maintaining order. It was about helping people, real people, find a way out of the situations they had been born into. Several months after David began working with the outreach program, he received an unexpected invitation, a formal invitation from the FBI task force that Samuel Brooks had helped establish. The task force, now gaining national attention, was holding a summit in Ridgeview to discuss racial bias in law enforcement and community policing initiatives. David was surprised to find his name on the guest list, but it was clear that Samuel had played a role in extending the invitation. At first, David wasn't sure if he should attend. He knew that walking into a room filled with law enforcement officials and activists, many of whom knew his story, would be uncomfortable. But after everything he had been through, he also knew that facing his past head-on was the only way forward. On the day of the summit, David arrived at the Ridgeview Civic Center, dressed in a simple button-down shirt and slacks. The atmosphere inside the hall was electric, with people from all walks of life, police officers, activists, community leaders, gathered to discuss the pressing issues of the day. As David made his way through the crowd, he spotted Samuel standing near the stage, deep in conversation with a group of task force members. Their eyes met briefly, and Samuel gave David a small nod of acknowledgement. The summit began with speeches from various officials, each addressing the importance of police reform and community engagement. Samuel was one of the keynote speakers, and as he took the stage, David couldn't help but feel a sense of pride for the man who had once been his adversary. Samuel's speech was powerful, focusing on the need for systemic change in the role that both law enforcement and the community had to play in building a better future. "Change doesn't happen overnight," Samuel said, his voice steady and commanding. "But it starts with each of us, taking responsibility for our actions, owning our mistakes, and committing to doing better. It's not about pointing fingers. It's about finding solutions, together." As the applause echoed through the hall, David felt a sense of hope that he hadn't felt in a long time. After the summit, David approached Samuel, unsure of what to expect. But when Samuel saw him, he smiled warmly and extended his hand. "Good to see you, David," Samuel said, his tone genuine. David shook his hand, feeling a sense of closure that he hadn't realized he needed. "You too," he replied. "You gave a great speech." Samuel nodded. "Thanks. And I heard about the work you've been doing with the outreach program. That's good stuff. It's exactly what we need more of." David smiled, feeling a swell of pride. "I'm trying. It's been different, but it feels right." Samuel clapped him on the shoulder. "That's what matters. Keep at it." For the first time in a long time, David felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. As the months passed, David's work with the outreach program continued to grow. He became a trusted mentor, not just to the kids but also to the other volunteers and staff. His experience as a former cop gave him a unique perspective, one that allowed him to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community in a way that few others could. He also began speaking at local schools and community centers, sharing his story and the lessons he had learned. It wasn't easy to stand in front of a crowd and admit his mistakes, but David knew that being honest about his past was the only way to create real change. The impact of his work didn't go unnoticed. Slowly but surely, David's reputation in Ridgeview began to shift. People who had once viewed him with suspicion or anger now saw him as a man who was working to make things right. It wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning from it and moving forward. Samuel's task force continued to expand, and while their paths didn't always cross, David and Samuel stayed in touch. They had come a long way from the day of that fateful arrest in the park, and both men knew that their journeys were far from over. For David, the road to redemption wasn't a straight path. It was filled with challenges, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But he had learned that the key to redemption wasn't about perfection. It was about perseverance, about showing up every day and doing the hard work of making things right. And for the first time in his life, David Carter felt like he was truly making a difference. 2 years had passed since the day Samuel Brooks and David Carter crossed paths in Ridgeview Park. In that time, both men had seen their worlds change in ways they could have never imagined. David's journey toward redemption continued, and Samuel's work with the FBI's Racial Bias Task Force had begun to see real, tangible results. But more importantly, their efforts had started to leave a lasting impact on the communities they served. Ridgeview, once a quiet town largely untouched by larger social movements, had become a focal point for conversations about law enforcement reform. The outreach program where David worked had expanded, with new volunteers and partnerships forming between local schools and the police department. Slowly but surely, the walls of distrust between the police and the community were coming down. David's presence in the program had helped bridge the gap between authority figures and the at-risk youth of Ridgeview. He had become a mentor not just to the boys in his group, but to many in the community who had once viewed him as part of the problem. His honesty about his past and willingness to admit his mistakes had earned him a level of respect he had never imagined. One morning, as David prepared for another day at the program, he received a phone call from Samantha Ellis, the program director. Her voice sounded excited more than usual. "David, I've got some good news," she said, barely able to contain her excitement. "The city council has agreed to fund an expansion for the outreach program. They want us to start working with other towns, helping them set up their own mentorship programs." David felt a surge of pride. He had been pushing for this kind of expansion for months, and now it was finally happening. "That's incredible," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "What's the next step?" "We're going to start training volunteers in neighboring towns," Samantha replied, "and we want you to lead the charge. You've been a huge part of our success, David. The city wants you to share what we've done here with others." David's chest swelled with pride, but there was also a hint of nervousness. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight. But this was bigger than him now. This was about creating real, lasting change in communities that needed it. "I'd be honored," he said finally. "Let's do it." While David was helping to expand the outreach program, Samuel Brooks was deep in the heart of the FBI's continued efforts to address racial bias in law enforcement. His task force had grown in size and scope, and their work was being recognized nationwide. One of Samuel's greatest accomplishments had been the development of a new training protocol for police departments, designed to help officers recognize and address their own implicit biases. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a step in the right direction. Departments across the country had begun implementing the program, and early feedback suggested it was making a difference. But for Samuel, it wasn't enough. He knew that true systemic change would take generations to fully realize, and he was determined to see it through, no matter how long it took. One evening, as Samuel was reviewing reports from a recent training session in another city, he received an unexpected phone call. It was from his superior at the FBI, Director Alan McKenna, a man Samuel deeply respected. "Brooks, I've been keeping an eye on your work with the task force," McKenna said, his voice firm but warm. You've done some remarkable things. We're seeing real change in the departments that have adopted your protocols. Thank you, sir, Samuel replied, though he remained modest. But there's still a long way to go. I know that, McKenna said, and that's why I'm calling. I want you to take the lead on something new, something bigger. We've been getting interest from cities across the country that want to establish permanent oversight committees to ensure law enforcement agencies are adhering to anti-bias protocols. I want you to head up this new initiative. Samuel's breath caught in his throat. This was a huge responsibility, one that would put him at the forefront of a national movement. It was the kind of opportunity he had dreamed of, but it also came with enormous pressure. I'm honored, sir, Samuel said after a moment. I'll do whatever it takes. I knew you would, McKenna replied. We'll get started on the details tomorrow, but for now, I just wanted you to know, you're the right man for this. As the call ended, Samuel sat back in his chair, letting the weight of the moment wash over him. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but with each step, with each small victory, he felt like he was getting closer to the world he had always believed in. A world where justice was truly blind, and where everyone, regardless of their race or background, was treated with fairness and respect. Months passed, and the effects of Samuel and David's work began to ripple outward in ways neither of them could have predicted. David's expansion of the outreach program reached towns beyond Ridgeview, helping connect troubled youth with mentors who had lived through similar struggles. The program became a model for other communities dealing with strained relationships between the police and the public, and David found himself speaking at events and panels, sharing his experiences and the lessons he had learned. The program even started to catch the attention of national organizations, and soon David was invited to speak at a national conference on criminal justice reform. It was an opportunity he would have never imagined 2 years earlier. As David stood at the podium on the day of the conference, looking out at the crowd of policymakers, activists, and law enforcement officials, he felt a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt since the early days of his career as a cop. Only this time, the purpose was different. It wasn't about maintaining order or enforcing the law. It was about building bridges, about healing the divides that had been allowed to fester for too long. I'm not standing here today as a former cop, David began, his voice steady. I'm standing here as a man who made mistakes. But I've learned that those mistakes don't have to define you. What defines you is what you do after, how you make things right. The room was silent as David continued, sharing his story with raw honesty, detailing his journey from the day he wrongfully arrested Samuel Brooks to the work he was doing now. And I've learned that redemption isn't something you find on your own, he said. It's something you build piece by piece with the help of those around you. And most importantly, it's something you earn by putting in the work, by being willing to change. When David finished, the room erupted in applause. For the first time in a long time, David felt like he was truly making a difference, not just in his own life, but in the lives of others. 6 months after the conference, Samuel and David crossed paths once again. This time it was in Washington, D.C. at a national summit on law enforcement reform. Both men had been invited to speak, Samuel for his work with the FBI's task force, and David for the success of the outreach program. The summit was a far cry from their first tense encounter in Ridgeview, and as they greeted each other, there was an unspoken understanding between them. They had both come a long way since that day in the park, and though their journeys had been different, they had arrived at the same place, working toward a better, fairer world. After their speeches, Samuel and David found themselves sitting together at a quiet cafe near the summit venue. They talked about their work, their challenges, and their hopes for the future. You've done incredible things, David, Samuel said, taking a sip of his coffee. The way you've turned things around, it's inspiring. David smiled, shaking his head modestly. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you, Samuel. You gave me a second chance when you didn't have to. Samuel nodded. Everyone deserves a second chance, and you've earned yours. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the world go by outside the cafe window. It was a rare moment of calm in their otherwise busy lives, but both men knew that the work was far from over. As they finished their coffee, Samuel looked at David and smiled. You ready to keep going? David returned the smile, feeling a sense of clarity and purpose that had once seemed so elusive. Yeah, he said, nodding. I'm ready. And with that, they stood up, two men on the same path, ready to continue the work they had started, together. Years passed, and the world continued to evolve. Samuel's task force grew into a nationwide initiative, with hundreds of police departments across the country adopting the anti-bias training protocols he had developed. David's outreach program expanded even further, cities and towns that had once been divided by mistrust and fear. The two men remained in touch, their paths crossing frequently as they worked toward the same goal. In Ridgeview, the impact of their efforts was visible in the faces of the young people David had mentored. Many of them had gone on to finish school, find jobs, and become active members of the community. Some had even started their own mentorship programs, inspired by the man who had once been a symbol of authority, but had become a beacon of hope. As Samuel and David looked back on their journeys, they knew that the work was never truly finished, but they also knew that they had planted the seeds of change, seeds that would continue to grow long after they were gone. And in the end, that was what mattered most.